Lord, as we go into your word today, I pray that you will examine the hearts of every individual here. And for those who end up watching this later online, I pray that you'll examine their hearts as well. That you will cleanse it of anything that distracts us, God. Because there are so many different things that could distract us in this world. So many things that even whenever we're trying to focus on your word, that can just pull us out of it and try to draw us towards anything other than you. So I pray that you will purge us, God, that you will cleanse us, help us focus entirely on you and totally on you. And through the studying of your word, God, I pray that you will increase our faith in you and increase our love for one another. And if we're already doing fine in both of those things, I hope that you will help us do even better, God. And I hope that you will help us continue to increase, that we will learn what it means to walk in you and walk with you and to live for you, God. As we go into your word, let us not interpret it according to our own understanding, but let your Spirit be present with us, guiding us into understanding so we can interpret it according to your will and according to your design and understand how you intended it to be understood when you first wrote it. And let us seek ways to apply it in our own lives if it be fitting. And by the end of this study, may we desire to be closer to you than ever before, and may we be closer to you than we were at the beginning of this study, God. We praise you, Lord, for everything that you are. We thank you for what you've done, what you are doing, what you will do. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, there he is. What's up, Rocky? Okay, so this is going to be our final week in Colossians. Which is kind of exciting, kind of sad because I've enjoyed going through Colossians. But I'm even more excited because starting next week, we are going to be hopping right back in and going straight into 2 Samuel. Because we went through 1 Samuel, and then we took a break, went to Colossians. Originally, that was only going to be a 4-week thing, but I did what I do best and talked a little bit too long and went a little bit too deep, and it ended up being a much longer series than it was going to be. But starting next week, we are going to go back into 2 Samuel, and we're just going to hit the ground running, and we're going to try to do a chapter a week, if at all possible. Ben and I are only going to be here for 2 weeks after this week, so we've got this week and then 2 more weeks. Then we're going to be gone in Israel for 2 weeks, but the plan is that y'all are going to keep on trucking without us, and so I've already talked to Sean and Brianne about that, and hopefully we'll be able to meet up, and y'all are going to be in, Lord willing, 2 Samuel chapters 3 and 4 while we're gone, and they will be leading y'all through that, and they will probably do a far better job than I ever could, and so it'll be cool. And then we'll be back, and we'll be able to just keep on going. I'm excited because Samuel, I already talked to y'all about this. I love those books. I love Colossians as well, but I really like going through the stuff that people don't go through as much. And when it comes to the life of David, people typically only know select portions of it, whereas whenever you know the full story, it just makes it that much richer. So I'm excited to do that. But that is not today, so we should probably start talking about Colossians. I'm going to recap the context for us, and I'm going to do it much more briefly than we typically do, just because I'm not going to go play by play. I'm just going to basically tell you the basic gist of it. The Apostle Paul is writing. If you don't remember who the Apostle Paul is, he's basically this guy who started out as a persecutor of the early church until God totally just transformed his life, called him to be a Christian, and not only to be a Christian, but to be an apostle, one who spoke authoritatively the commandments of God and went around just transforming the world. He traveled around, and we would probably not be sitting here if it was not for the Apostle Paul, because he did more for the Gentile church than basically any other Christian in the first century. He did just amazing stuff. He wrote so many books of the Bible, but honestly, if you were to ask people back in the first century, Paul's main contribution, the letters would probably just be like a footnote, because how many churches he planted and how many people owed their salvation to him is remarkable. But we don't know Paul, and all the churches that he planted probably don't exist anymore. But what does remain is the books that he wrote, and at one point he was in prison in Rome. Actually, he was in prison in Rome on different occasions. But on one occasion, he was in prison, and he wrote 4 different books: Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And we've been going through Colossians, right? It was sent to a church in a town called Colossae, which is in Turkey. And in this letter, he's never actually visited the Colossian church, but he is just informing them about certain things that he had heard about what was going on in that church. And the book is 4 chapters long. He spends the first 2 chapters basically detailing doctrine, just explaining what we believe. And then he spends the last 2 chapters dealing with more like practical stuff. And that's usually how Paul functions, because you'll see whenever it comes to reading Paul's letters that what we believe changes how we live. And so we need to know who we have faith in order to know how to love one another, right? Because the way we live is going to be directly reflected on the character of Christ, right? Like we see what Jesus did and we're like, okay, now I need to go do that. And so he spends the first 2 chapters just giving theology, right? He talks about how amazing and preeminent and above everything Jesus is. And that's really his main thesis, because he's just saying, hey, there's this dude who walked around 30 years ago and he was more than just a dude. He was more than just a carpenter. He was more than just a rabbi. He was more than just the Messiah. He was more than just the Savior. He was literally God in the flesh, which might sound hard to wrap your mind around, and it is, but it's true. And he starts just laying out the implications of that teaching. If he's God in the flesh and he came down and died for us, then that means we can be redeemed and we can be saved and we can actually be reunited with him and with one another. And it's this beautiful just doctrine and theology, and it's really impactful and powerful. And that leads him into chapters 3 and 4, where he starts talking about, when the rubber meets the road, how does that affect us? And he says, well, if Jesus is who he claims to be, and if he did what the Bible says he did and what Christians teach he did, then that means that we are not who we once were, right? We were one way, now we're another. The thing that happened in between was him. Okay, so we need to get rid of the old stuff and put on the new stuff. Because we kind of live in this weird in-between state where Jesus came and he died and he saved us. And so in the eyes of God, we are righteous and we are pure and we're amazing. But at the same time, we haven't received those resurrected bodies. And Christ has not come back and established his physical kingdom. And so while in the eyes of God, we are righteous and pure and amazing, we're still corrupt individuals. Fortunately, God gave us his Spirit to dwell inside of us, to help us live for him as we live in this weird in-between state, right? Christ came and Christ is returning, and in the meantime, we need to figure out how to live for him in these short days of our lives, right? And so Paul says, by the power of the Spirit, we need to put off the old self, right? Because our passions are kind of split between us. One side of us really wants to live for the world and live for ourselves, and there's this other side that really wants to live for God, but usually it's the worldly self that wins out. And so he kind of talks about it like changing clothes. Right? Okay, you once wore these old clothes. You need to consciously strip yourself of those and just go burn them. And then you need to put on new clothes. And so he spent some time detailing what that looks like. And then what we talked about last week, we devoted the whole week to just talking about these few verses. He started talking about the impact of this on authority. If there is a God who is an authority over all things, and we have submitted to him, and we now belong to his kingdom, we kind of need to know what the social structure of that kingdom is, right? Like, how does this kingdom actually look? And we see that God established authority structures in the world. And he just uses the example of a Christian household to demonstrate stuff. He uses the 3 examples, right? He uses husbands and wives, he uses parents and children, and he uses masters and slaves to demonstrate that God has put certain people in charge and certain people in submission to the people in charge. And as Christians, we need to obey what God has put there. And in other places, Paul will also talk about this in relation to government. Peter also talks about this in 1 Peter. I've been leading my students through 1 Peter, and it's remarkable because Peter says, honor the emperor, which, if you know who was emperor at the time of Peter writing that, and at the time of Paul writing this stuff, it was this guy named Nero, who wasn't really a big fan of Christians. He actually kicked off the whole worldwide Christian persecution thing. For a long time, persecution was kind of limited to just the Judea region. But whenever Nero got in charge, he was like, no, let's make this a worldwide thing. And he burned down the city of Rome, and he blamed it on the Christians. And as a result of that, massive Christian persecution broke out. And so Nero was not a great guy. He was not a godly person. Yet you have Peter and Paul and other stuff saying, honor the emperor. Submit to the authorities above you. And there were 2 key principles that we picked up on last week in regards to authority. Do you remember what they were? There was a principle in regards to those in authority and those in regards to people under authority. What was the principle for those in authority? Don't abuse the authority, right? And for those under authority, what was the principle?
Submit.
Yeah, submit to the authority, right? Which, when you put it that way, it sounds really simple. but we spent the whole week talking about it because we realized that it's actually very difficult because it goes against every single facet of our human nature, because we like being in control, we like being independent, we don't like submitting to authority, but we also spent time talking about how if we actually learned to do that, it would be a very beautiful picture, right? Like, we talked about how really these are ideals, right? If you have the wife submitting to the husband and the husband loving the wife as he should, it's a beautiful portrait of marriage. If you have children submitting to their parents as they should and parents not provoking their children, it's a beautiful picture of a family. If you have slaves submitting out of the cheerfulness of their hearts and you have masters not abusing their slaves, it's a beautiful portrait of authority, right? And all of these authority situations are meant to point us back to God, because Christ is the groom, we are the bride. God is the father, we are the children. Jesus is Lord, we are the slaves, right? And so all of these point us back to God, and that's why he's established these authorities. Because yes, we live in the kingdom of earth, but we belong to the kingdom of heaven. And so we look at these relationships on earth as if they were supposed to point us to heaven, right? And so that's what we talked about last week. And that leads us to chapter 4, verse 2. This is one of those weird places where the chapter divisions was just really inconvenient and weird because for some reason the whole authority thing went all the way into chapter 4, verse 1. And I don't know why they didn't just put that at the end of chapter 3, but I didn't divide this stuff. So we start in chapter 4, verse 2, and I'm just going to read the whole slide, and then we're going to talk about it. And what we're going to see is that a lot of this stuff is mainly just like wrapping up the letter. This slide will have a little bit more application, but whenever we get to the second slide, it's going to be mainly just wrapping things up. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word, to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Tychicus will tell you about my activities. He is a beloved brother and a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. And with him, Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. They will tell you of everything that has taken place here. All right. So we get some name drops at the bottom of this, which are kind of exciting, and I'll explain those whenever we get there, or maybe I'll see if some of y'all can explain them. But what are some things that stick out to you right off the bat?
Continuing in prayer, and just being thankful for what God has done and what He will do.
Yes. What else? Yeah.
He's declaring the mystery of Christ again.
Once again, yeah, we're going to have to reiterate what that mystery is. It's a very prominent thing, especially in these letters. It's very interesting how I see this in my own stuff, where I was actually talking about this before we started the actual Bible study when we were answering the question of the week. I was talking about how it seems like God kind of functions as a teacher sometimes and teaches us just different lessons at different points in our lives. And I've noticed this whenever I look at my own writings, that sometimes there are just certain themes that I'm just like stuck on. And you see that in Paul's writings. Like in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which were written a lot earlier on in his ministry, he is talking nonstop about the coming of Christ. And he does talk about the coming of Christ a lot here, but you can see that it's almost developed more. And now he's more thinking about the mystery of Christ. And he's talking about the impact of his future coming and how that affects Jewish and Gentile relationships. And you see that all throughout Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon, which are those 4 books he wrote during the prison epistles, during his time in prison. And then later on, whenever you get to like 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and stuff, there's also more themes that are like unique to those. And I just kind of love that because there's like this thread where you can see like, you can almost like read Paul's passion into each letter because you can figure out like what was just like running through his mind as he's writing this. And I just think that's kind of cool. That's something that I've always liked, even when it comes to reading people's journals. Not that I go around reading other people's journals. I'm saying like things that have been published, right? I just love that because I love stepping inside people's minds and seeing what they're passionate about. That's one thing whenever we go to 2 Samuel, we'll probably start revisiting some of David's Psalms because those are really insightful because you get to see what David is thinking as certain things are taking place. And I just think that's really cool. But yeah, so we do see the mystery showing up again. Anything else that sticks out to y'all right off the bat?
The seasoned with salt.
Seasoned with salt. What a rich metaphor, right? Good stuff. All right, let's walk through it. So this is coming right off the thing where he was saying about, masters don't provoke your servants or anything like that. And he says, continue steadfastly in prayer. First off, who is he talking to? Chiefly the Colossians. And that's something that I've just been trying to teach us, is that sometimes we're very quick to just take what the Bible says and say, it's about me. There's always a step we have to take in between there, right? He is writing to the Colossians chiefly, and then we have to ask, does this apply to us as well? This is one of those places where I think it's like, well, yeah, it couldn't hurt, right? This is something where he's writing to Gentile Christians, and he's saying, continue steadfastly in prayer, and this commandment is not specifically tied to them being in Colossae, right? This is just a general statement that he is saying to Christians, so of course it applies to us as well. And it's not really significant to bring it up here. I'm just saying that because that's something I'm trying to get us more mindful of in general. Because as Christians, we're far too quick to make every single passage about us. Whereas I don't want to do that. I'm wanting to be safe there. So he says, continue steadfastly in prayer. What does that mean? What does that look like? What does it mean to continue steadfastly in prayer? Why would he even bring that up?
It's important to continually talk to God. Because it's for your safety against the enemy, and it's also good for your walk with Him.
Yeah. What does it mean? What does steadfast mean? Firm. Right. Ongoing. Right. The idea is something that it endures. Right. That's why sometimes people take the word hesed and translate it as steadfast love. Right. Because it's not a love that just like comes and goes. It is a love that endures for the long run. It's an enduring love. Right, so if he's saying continue in steadfast love, continue steadfastly in prayer, he's saying keep praying and don't stop praying. Which this isn't even his main point, but right off the bat it lets you know that prayer seems to be significant. Right, so we just opened up this whole Bible study with prayer, and I think this is one place where maybe the more hyper charismatic groups actually get it better than we do. Where sometimes we treat prayer just kind of like one of those things like, oh yeah, we should pray. But it's like, no, according to Paul, it does affect things and it changes things. And so we should do it. And before he even goes to any of this other stuff, he says, make sure you're continuing in prayer. But he continues, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. What the heck does that mean? Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving.
Always be thankful.
Yeah, always be thankful. So, in other words, make sure that your prayers aren't specifically, hey God, I know I haven't talked to you in a while, but here's a list of all the things that I want. Amen. It seems like for Paul, prayer is not primarily a means for self-service. It's a means for giving thanks to God. Right? And yes, in other places, Paul does say, yes, lay all your needs before God. But in many ways, I think that we've kind of flip-flopped it, right? And a lot of the times we pray to God, and even, it's not even necessarily bad things, right? We're just like, God, help me love you more. That is a good prayer, right? Because, it's focused on Him. But we often only do that, and we don't actually take time to thank Him. And that's why I always have somebody pray, just a prayer of gratitude, because I think that's a big aspect of the Bible that we just miss out on. And that's one place where Christians fail, right? Because we complain just as much as everybody else, whereas I don't think that that's a mentality that Paul would tolerate. If Paul were sitting amongst us nowadays and he heard how Christians talk, he would probably say, where is your gratitude? Because you complain like everybody else in the world. How easily do you forget that the Savior of the universe came down and died for you, and He has given you everything you need? What reason could you possibly have to complain, even about the worst possible thing happening? And so gratitude is also a very big aspect of the Christian life that we typically neglect. And so I like to emphasize it. So just keep that in mind. The prayer is not only about, God, I need this. It's being watchful in it with thanksgiving, right? So you're paying close attention to go out of your way to thank God for all that he's doing, right? And voicing that thanks to him. I just think that's cool. It's not just treating God like a genie in a bottle. Yeah. At the same time, pray also for us. Okay, so you do pray for things, right? You see how he follows it up with that. Pray also for us that God may open to us a door for the word. All right. So what specifically is Paul asking them to pray about?
I think he's wanting them to ask God to give them opportunities to witness for him, like to talk about him to others.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Like, in comparison to what we typically ask for prayers about. And once again, I'm not at all trying to downplay what we typically ask for prayer requests about, right? I mean, we should pray for one another's health. We should pray for those things. Rather, I'm trying to highlight the nuance that Paul gives to it, and it just shows you where Paul's mind's at. This is stuff we typically don't even think about. Typically, we're so focused on the worldly needs, like health and things like that, that we don't even set aside time to think about stuff like this. But Paul says, I just want you to devote time to prayer that God would open up the door for us to be able to reach more people with the word of God. Right? Because there's certain places where he talks about this all the time, where he feels like doors are like being closed or something's preventing him from reaching certain people. And he says, just pray that God will open those doors and we'll be able to reach them. Like, that's a really interesting mindset if you think about it. Like, imagine that. Imagine I was like, hey, do we have any prayer requests? And then one of us in the group says, yeah, I really have just been wanting to share the gospel with like this group of people. And it just, something's been keeping it from happening. Could we pray for me to, like, for God to open up that door so I could do that? I mean, like, we'd probably be like looking at that person and be like, wow, like, you win the Christian award of the day. Like, that's an amazing mentality. Like, we're over here like praying for like all our worldly things, like, oh yeah, like, you know, like, not that those things are bad, but this person is just like thinking on a different level. Like, they're not thinking about anything self-serving. It's entirely just like, yeah, I want more opportunities to share God. And right now, I feel like things are preventing me from doing that. So could we pray that like those doors will open? It's like, whoa. Like, that's just an amazing mentality. And he's saying that they should pray for that. So how much more should we be praying for that, knowing that there's a bunch of people who need to be reached, right? So it's just like, that's cool to me. Little things like that tell you a lot about Paul's character, and I just love it. At the same time, pray also for us that God may open to us a door for the word, to declare the mystery of Christ. Okay, Rocky pointed this out earlier, because we have that word mystery showing up again. We talked about this earlier on in Colossians, right? It was like back in like chapter 1, or maybe 2. I think it was chapter 1. What the heck is the mystery of Christ? What is this referring to? Rocky.
Jesus died not just for his people, but for everybody.
Yeah. So people will debate about what the mystery is, and so I don't want to say that dogmatically that is 100% what it is every time. But the more I study Scripture, it seems like that is the common denominator between all the times it's being used. It seems like most often, and specifically in Colossians, it seems like that's just his focus, and also in Ephesians, it seems like when he says the mystery of Christ, he is specifically talking about the fact that the King of the Jews was actually the King of the universe. Right? So for thousands of years, the Jewish people had been waiting for their king to come and establish the kingdom, and they had been thinking, in many ways, that the kingdom was only going to be for them. But then Jesus shows up and he says, take the gospel to all nations. And as the apostles go back and they study the scriptures, they're like, how did we miss this? Because whenever you look at the Old Testament, there's a bunch of places where God makes it very clear. It's not just about the Jews. I mean, I've been in Genesis chapter 12 for the last 3 days. And God says to Abraham, I will bless you, I will make a great name of you, and in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. He doesn't just say, in you, your family will be blessed. He says, all the families. So whenever, like, from the moment God calls Abraham, he is saying, in your line, everybody's going to receive a blessing. So it was never just about Abraham. And if you keep following it through, you'll see that that's the case, right? It's never just about the people of Israel. And that's where people were so confused. Because they lost sight of it. And it's very easy to do if you're not paying close attention, right? So that's why I think Paul calls it a mystery, because it is just like a mystery, right? It's just like a Sherlock Holmes thing, to where you're reading a Sherlock Holmes book or you're watching a movie and you get to the end and the mystery is solved and you're like, how did I miss that? And then you have to go rewatch it to see all the places you overlooked. That's exactly what's happening here, because it's so easy to read through the Old Testament and think that, oh, it's just about the Jewish people. And that's actually a big debate people have, because they're like, oh, like there's literally camps that suggest, oh no, you were once saved by the law and now you're saved by Christ, which is totally contrary to what the Bible says. But you can see how people might land there, because they're like, well, if you were always saved by Christ, then what's the purpose of the Old Testament? Well, you have to go look, and you have to see that God's purpose for choosing Israel was not just about salvation. It was really about the image of God, right? So originally man was created to reflect God's image, and then through a series of different rebellions, they're kicked out of the garden, and eventually there's the Tower of Babel thing, and God disperses them amongst the nations, right? So now there's multiple nations. And what God decides to do is he decides to pick one nation to basically be his image bearers, right? Okay, I'm going to choose this nation to represent me to the rest of the world. And so he chooses Israel not because they're special and not because they're immediately saved. He chooses them to represent him to everybody else so that everybody can look to Israel and get a picture of the God of the universe, right? And so the whole mystery is that it was always about Jews and Gentiles. It was never just about the Jews, but when you look at the Old Testament, you might be tempted to think it was just about the Jews. And I love that. And I think that's why Paul's so excited about it too, because you have to recognize it's a lot easier for me to say this as a Gentile because I get to reap the benefit of this. It's like, oh yeah, well heck yeah, it's not just about the Jews, it's about me too. But Paul was a Jew, and he's excited about this. And he's like, this is awesome. Like, it's not just about us, it's about everyone. And the king that we've been waiting for was actually a much bigger deal than we thought. He wasn't just the king of the Jews, he's the king of the world, and he's not just the king of the world, he's God in the flesh. So basically Jesus showed up and just blew away their expectations. And that's what he's asking them to pray about. Pray specifically that the door may be open for us to spread the word to declare the mystery of Christ. And that's because he's the apostle to the Gentiles, right? That's how Paul views himself. And so he views it as his God-mandated mission, and it's not just him viewing it that way. God specified to him, this is his mission, to take the gospel to the Gentiles, to proclaim the mystery to them. Hey, y'all don't know who the Messiah is, but I'm here to tell you about him. And he's not just the king of the Jews. He's your king too, if you accept him and receive him. That's what he's excited about. To declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison. On account of which I am in prison. How does that make sense? Why is he in prison at this time?
The people during that time didn't want him to preach.
Yes. Do you remember where he was at when he was originally thrown in prison?
Israel.
He was in Israel. Specifically, what city? First one that comes to mind. Jerusalem. Right? He went down to Jerusalem, and he's thrown in prison. And some people debate about this. Some people think that Paul was wrong to go to Jerusalem. I don't think that. But there's people who debate about certain passages in the book of Acts where people are trying to say, no, you shouldn't go to Jerusalem. And Paul's like, no, I'm going to go. And so some people think he should have listened to the people. I think Paul was in the right. He goes down to Jerusalem, and he's preaching this message, and it causes a stir. And one key aspect to it is the fact that they're debating about what the role of Jews and Gentiles are, and they're kind of charging Paul with not really adhering to the Jewish stuff. So he's eventually thrown in prison because he's willing to stand up for this, right? And he talked about this earlier on in the book where he was saying he's suffering on account of them, right? And we talked about how his suffering was in many ways to encourage them because he's saying, hey, if I'm willing to suffer for y'all, that means that I don't have any ulterior motives, right? He's not gaining women or wealth or anything like that from this. He's suffering. So he's in prison in Jerusalem. They bring him up to Caesarea, and he's there for a while. And they're about to release him, but then Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. And basically, because Paul was a Roman citizen, if he's appealing to Caesar, they have to grant him an audience before Caesar himself. And they're like, dude, we were about to release you. If you didn't do this, you were about to be free to go. And Paul's like, it's all right. I don't mind being in prison. Paul had always wanted to go to Rome, and he'd never been able to go there. And so now he gets a free trip. There's a shipwreck and stuff in between. But he eventually gets to Rome, and he's put in prison in Rome, and that's why he's there, right? And so he literally is there on account of the mystery of Christ, right? Him defending the fact that Jews and Gentiles can both be united in Jesus Christ is why he's in prison, and it's why he's in Rome. Because he didn't just want to leave it in Judea, he wanted to go all the way to the center of the Roman Empire, to the center of Gentile area. And so that's kind of cool. Like, it's not just him being poetic. This is like quite literally why he's in prison. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear, which is how I ought to speak. So what is he chiefly concerned with? Not looking for anything necessarily profound here.
I just think back in the letter to Philippians when he talks about how like he's preaching to the prison guards, and he says like everyone there knows like why he's there.
Yeah, and I think honestly what he's asking for is a pretty simple request, just that he'd be able to articulate the gospel clearly, right? And that he wouldn't mess it up, and that, because one thing we've talked about this a few times in Colossians, Paul's always concerned about like laboring in vain, right? He doesn't like the idea. Like, he recognizes something that we probably all need to recognize. He recognizes that God has given us a very limited amount of time on earth, and that time on earth should be devoted primarily to serving his kingdom, right? And that means that there's a world around us that needs Jesus, and we owe it to God and to those people to devote as much of our effort to helping them know Jesus as possible. Right? And so Paul is wanting to live every moment of his life pointing people to Jesus. And so sometimes he'll write people letters and he'll be like, hey, I'm writing you this letter because I want to make sure I didn't labor in vain amongst you. Because I dedicated a lot of time to making sure that you knew what we believed. And I've heard reports that you've kind of strayed from that. And so I want to write this to correct you, because if you leave this, that means I wasted my time on you and I could have served somebody else better. And which sounds kind of harsh, but it's true. Because he's like, I want to point people to Christ, and I don't want to waste my time because I want to spend time on people who are going to believe. He's going to talk about that in a second in regards to how the Colossians need to function. But he's saying, pray for me not only that the door would be opened, but that when the door is opened, I would be able to articulate the gospel in a way that bears fruit, and that I would be able to speak clearly, which is how I ought to. And I think he's probably also addressing the idea of not being ashamed. Right? The idea of, he's been in prison for this for a few years now. And the idea is that once he's freed, he's probably not going to be hooping and hollering to go back to prison. Paul handles prison really well, but I doubt that he was like, yeah, I can't wait to go to prison again. That's not really anybody's mentality. And so the temptation would be to be like, okay, I just spent a few years in prison. I'm just going to pull back a little bit. But he's like, no, pray for me that I would be bold, that I would be clear, that I wouldn't pull any punches, but that I would share the gospel as I ought to. And I should share it clearly, even if it results in me being in prison again. And sure enough, he is going to go to prison again, and whenever he goes to prison again, he's going to get killed. But I think that's mainly what he's talking about. Which, once again, this dude, what a guy. This is why Paul is such a powerhouse. You just read this stuff, you're like, whoa. This guy's just operating at a totally different level than we typically are. If I was writing in prison, I would not be saying this to people. I'd be like, hey, send me some food and pray that I won't be depressed and pray that I get out of here soon. Paul's not asking about any of that, right? He's not asking for food. He's not asking to not be depressed. He's not asking to be released soon. He's like, I just pray that God would give me more opportunities to share him, even if it lands me in prison again. It's like, wow, okay. It's like, well, that's convicting in and of itself. And so that's what he's wanting them to pray about in regards to him. But then he also has final advice to them. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders. What does that mean? First off, who are outsiders?
The world.
The world, right? People who are not Christians. What is the importance of distinguishing outsiders and insiders? fruit of the Spirit? Well, yeah, because we shouldn't place expectations on outsiders that we should on insiders, right? This is what people get wrong all the times. They always talk about like the whole judge not lest ye be judged thing, which is a good principle, right? Jesus says it, but he specifically uses that in the context of the same judgment you pour out on another person will be poured back on you. So basically, check yourself before you wreck yourself. That's the principle. But Paul specifies that judgment is strictly limited to insiders, right? So I can't go and point at somebody who's not a Christian and really get onto them about something that they would only be obeying if they were a Christian, right? Well, according to the Bible, you shouldn't be doing this. Well, yeah, they're not Christians. Why would you expect them to do that? Meanwhile, if I see one of y'all doing something that the Bible says not to do, I should be like, hey, Rocky, we need to sit down and talk. And if y'all see me doing that, you should say, David, we need to sit down and talk, right? Because there, the judgment is fine as long as we're coming at it from like a humble and like gentle and loving spirit. But he's saying, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, because that probably is the more difficult thing to do, right? This is what Christians have a difficult time with constantly. This is honestly why a lot of people view Christians as total jerks. Because a lot of the times as Christians, we don't walk in wisdom towards outsiders. We just take the easy path and we just treat outsiders as if they were insiders, right? And we will just, if anything, we'll actually call out outsiders on their stuff more than we will on insiders, right? Like we'll say, oh, I know you're not a Christian, but I'm going to get on to you about this. It's like, well, okay, they're not Christians. Why would you expect them to adhere to a Christian ethic, right? You just can't expect that. We serve two different gods. We were even having this discussion in our devotional this morning for our staff. We get together on Tuesdays and Thursdays, have a little devotional, and they were talking about some stuff, and my boss looked at me after the devotional, and she's like, I could tell you had something going on in your head. She totally called me out too. She was like, I could tell you had something that you wanted to say. And I was like, oh, I always have stuff I want to say. She says, well, would you like to share it? And I kind of just was like, And she was like, not yet? I'm like, nah, probably not yet. She was like, that's fine. And I actually appreciated that. I appreciated that she was like, okay, that's fine. I thought she was going to force me to say it. But I was taking issue with some of the stuff they were saying because, honestly, like just the issue is that one person was talking about somebody in their family who was not saved, who was dealing with more like the LGBT type stuff, right? Like just like desires and everything. And they were like, the whole conversation was really like everybody giving advice on how to get that person out of those desires. And for me, I was trying to find a way to like lovingly kind of like correct them, because to me, I'm like, that's not the main issue, right? Because if that person is not a Christian, why would you expect them to know that's wrong, right? Because if they're not a Christian, then why wouldn't they just follow what they feel, right? If they're serving themselves, okay. Once you're a Christian, and once you recognize that you are not your own and that you serve God, well then his rules matter. And so what he says in the Bible all of a sudden is very important to you, right? And I was trying to think of a way to concisely put this because we only have a few minutes in devotionals, and I didn't want, like, I knew I was going to be a little bit outnumbered. And I was trying to think, okay, how do I put this in a way that, like, doesn't dig a hole for me? But that's one issue, is that we view outsiders and we try to hold them to the same standard, and God is, of course, going to hold them to that standard, right? Because whether they like it or not, God is impartial, right? And when judgment day comes, everybody's going to have to answer for their sin. But whenever it comes to sharing the gospel with them, we have to recognize that if they don't already believe in Christ, we shouldn't expect them to adhere to Christ's commands, right? And so I think that's why he's saying walk in wisdom, because it's a lot more difficult than just a black and white scenario. And that's really what wisdom is, right? Knowledge is typically black and white, right? You know this, you don't know this. Wisdom is whenever you find the gray area and you realize, okay, sometimes there's going to be case-by-case scenarios where you have to handle things differently, right? So in Proverbs, which is all about wisdom, you have one verse that says, answer a fool according to his folly. And the very next verse says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. And it's like, wait, what? And it's saying, well, it depends on the scenario. Sometimes you need to answer that guy because you need to call him out. Sometimes it's better to hold your tongue because you're actually just goading him along and increasing his folly, right? And so wisdom is recognizing that there is gray area and you need to figure out how to handle that. And so that's why he's saying walk in wisdom, right? It's not like you can't just act like talking to people who aren't Christians is an easy thing. You have to be very mindful about that. The discussions that we have as a group, fairly easy. Because if we have a discussion and we have a debate and we have a disagreement, all we have to do is say, let's open up the Bible and figure out what it has to say. Because we all view the Bible as authoritative. If you're talking with a non-Christian, you can't do that, right? I mean, you can show them the Bible, and it might even teach them something, and they might go along with it, but that's not a guarantee. Because you have to convince them that the Bible is authoritative to begin with, right? So you actually have to take a few steps back and get them there. And so he's saying, walk in wisdom. Use discernment, use judgment, figure out how to do this, and in order to best figure that out, we need one another to be like, hey, Maverick, how would you handle this scenario? I'm trying to figure out how to handle my friend Chad over at work, and he's not a Christian, and he's going through this. What do I need to do? And so he's just saying, walk in wisdom. Making the best use of the time. What's that about? Don't waste your time. Absolutely. That is 100% what he's going for. What do you think he has in mind whenever he says this? Or does he just randomly bring it up?
I think he's saying, live your life for Jesus because the time is, running out. Because we have such a short time on this earth that there's gonna come a time when we're gonna be on our way to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And either we die or the Lord comes back.
Yeah. So whenever he says making best use of the time, he definitely has in mind the fact that you're either going to die one day or Christ is going to come back, right? So you're limited. But you'll notice that the translation here, I don't know what it's like in Greek, but at least in English here, they make this one sentence, right? Walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. So they seem to think that these two things are associated with one another. How are they associated?
You gotta schedule. You gotta make a plan.
Yeah, saying figure out how you could best use the times given to you when it comes to this. This is what I was talking about whenever Paul seems to have this struggle, because there's certain things that he feels that he wants to do, but then there's also the things that he feels God is telling him to do. And so he's like, okay, well, as much as I want to go to Colossae and visit them, God's leading me over here. As much as I want to go to Rome, God's leading me over here. This is something that, just for one example, there was this guy whenever I was in College Station. I was pretty good about I'm usually good at time management. And I would meet up with a bunch of just different guys throughout the week, just in a kind of discipleship situation. And there was one guy, and he would claim to be a Christian. I'm not convinced that he was, mainly for the reasons I'll tell you in a second. But we would meet up pretty regularly. And I was really, he seemed like he really wanted to meet up, and he said he wanted to be discipled. But as time progressed, and we met up each week, our meetings would grow longer, mainly because every time we got together, he had to tell me about more and more sins that he'd been committing. And it wasn't me asking, right? Typically that's not how I do it. I'm not like, hey, so how did you screw up this week? I don't do that. If you tell me, cool, but I'm not going to pry that information out of you. But he would just start telling me all this stuff, and it wasn't just small slip-ups. It was with each week, the things would get more and more excessive. And to me, it almost seemed like he was trying to sound like he was repentant, but really he was almost boasting in the sin, as if he was because it was kind of like the stuff that people think is kind of cool. It's like, oh yeah, I went did this crazy stuff this weekend, and I'm really sorry. I know I shouldn't have done it, but it's as I spent more time with him, I realized, you know what? There are other people I could be meeting up with who actually do want to grow in Christ, and this guy might say he wants to, but honestly, I'm not convinced he's a Christian. And that's obviously, God knows his heart better than I do, but that was a case where I had to make a choice, and I just had to stop meeting up with him, right? The guy told me that he wanted to grow, but after multiple weeks and months of meeting up, I was like, I'm not seeing that, and it felt like laboring in vain, because it seemed like I was really just becoming a vehicle through which he could boast about his sin and not actually grow. And I was like, there are other people out here who genuinely want to grow, and I could meet up with them, and we would actually I'd be growing, they'd be growing, it'd be amazing, it'd be beautiful, Christ would be being glorified, where I was like, I think my intentions in meeting up are pure, but I don't think Christ is actually being glorified in us gathering together right now. And so that was a case where I had to make that judgment. And Paul's saying to do the same thing specifically towards outsiders, right? So figure out, like, when it comes to preaching the gospel and sharing with people, don't just reduce it to empty actions like, oh, I'm just going to go preach on the street corner for an hour. Okay, I mean, you can do that if that seems like the best use of that time. But he's saying be mindful of it, right? Don't just reduce it to checking off boxes. Okay, I talked with 5 outsiders today. No, be mindful of it, pray about it, figure out how can I most effectively share Christ with people outside of the Christian body, right? Maybe that involves preaching on street corners. Maybe it involves recognizing that that's not your strength, and really it's through the interpersonal relationships that you establish at work, right? Maybe it does involve just going and just meeting random people. This is what he's just saying, be mindful of it, right? Don't just create boxes and say, okay, this is what you need to do, and if you do this, you're doing your job. This is what a lot of more cult-like people will do, mainly just because it's easy, right? I mean, Christians will do this as well, but you'll see this specifically with like Jehovah's Witness.
Yes.
They literally have to go and they have to do a certain amount of evangelizing each week if they want to make it to heaven, right? And it's literally a box you check. That's not what he's talking about. He says, no, it takes wisdom and discernment. Some weeks are going to have more of it than others, right? You need to use discernment and day by day figure out, like really it's a matter of waking up each morning and saying, God, how can I best serve you today? And one day might not necessarily look like the next. And it's literally case by case, constantly presenting yourself before Christ. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. What's he saying there?
I think what he means by let your speech always be gracious and seasoned with salt means talk to somebody in a kind, a kind manner, like with love and compassion.
Yeah. Yes?
It was kind of what you were saying earlier. If you're talking to someone that's a Christian versus not a Christian, you're going to say some things to a Christian person that you would not say to another person that's not a Christian. It's being very wise in what you say. You don't know.
For sure. I mean, the conversations that we have together in this group are going to be different than a conversation I would have with a non-Christian. And the conversations I would have in this group are probably going to be different than the conversations I would have with my students, who are mainly Christians. Right? I mean, just like, there's discernment there. But let's start specifically with the metaphor, because usually metaphors are employed to help you understand something better. Right? Seasoned with salt. What imagery does that, like what does that invoke in your mind?
Like, when you season something with salt, if you put the right amount, it tastes good. But when you put too much salt, it becomes more like a unsatisfying experience. And it's like very, gets your acid reflux going. It makes you feel not so good in the throat. Okay, so you're saying it takes discernment in how much salt you apply. But what is the intended effect of seasoning something with salt? It tastes good.
It enhances the flavor. So he's saying, conduct your speech in a way that the conversation's flavor is enhanced. Okay, so we're starting to make progress there. What do you think so what is the intended effect? Why do you enhance the flavor of food?
To make it taste better.
To make it taste better for who?
For your person you're serving.
The person eating it, yeah, the person you're serving. That actually, I prefer that language, right? You season the salt, you season the food with salt to make it taste better for the person you're serving. All right? So whenever you're seasoning your conversation with salt, why should you be doing that?
So you can better serve whoever you're talking to.
Yeah, so that you can better serve the people you're talking to, and you can make the conversation more delicious, right? Were you going to say something, Rocky?
And you can create another conversation next time you see them.
Exactly, right? So the goal should not be, this is what some Christians do, right? I'm just going to put so much truth in here so that they know, it's always grace and truth, right? Those two things in tension with one another. And they're not really tension because they both support one another. But as Christians, we like picking one or the other, right? You have those people who are all truth and no grace, and they just love I don't care how it makes you feel. I am going to just throw all this truth at you, which sometimes is needed, right? It's true. Facts don't care about your feelings, right? That is true. On the other hand, there are some people who do the opposite, and they're like, I just want to be so gracious that I'm never going to call you out on anything. Well, you don't really want to do that either, right? They have to be in tension with one another. And I think on the more really, there's two sides of Christianity that favor one or the other, right? It's more the progressive side of Christianity that favors the grace over truth. And the conservative side of Christianity, which is more our camp, we typically really favor the truth over grace thing, right? Where we're like, no, if your theology isn't 110% perfect, you're going to hell. And I don't care how hard I have to be mad at you. Like I don't care how it makes you feel, but I'm going to tell it to you to your face. That's not how Paul's wanting us to interact, right? He is saying that, yes, you should speak truthfully and you should speak graciously, but every interaction should be spoken in such a way that it encourages further interaction, right? You season stuff with salt so that people will come back and want to eat more, right? Because they're like, man, that person cooked some good food, right? So even if the person doesn't like what you're saying, hopefully they'll at least say, that was a good conversation, though, right? So you didn't just turn them off, because that's the effect. Some people, they talk with Christians, and because the Christians aren't using discernment, they're left being like, oh gosh, that Christian was just a total jerk. And you know what? Some people, they're just going to react that way, right? You can't control how people react. Some people are just going to do that no matter what. You could be the kindest, most genuine, discerning Christian, people will react that way. But I think that there's a lot of people who genuinely react that way because Christians are the ones in the wrong. And the Christians are just not being gracious at all, and they're so focused on demonstrating how they are right and the other person is wrong that the person is left with the idea, this person doesn't actually love me, and they don't actually want me to know a savior. They just wanted to demonstrate to me that they were correct. And we don't want to be those people, right? We want to be people to where, as far as we are capable of doing it, like as far as we're capable of controlling it, because once again, we can't control the people's responses, as best as we can do, we want to season our conversations with salt. So that when people talk with us, even if they don't like what we're saying, they'll recognize that it came from a place of love. And they'll say, you know what? I don't agree with what Sean said, but man, I know that he genuinely believed it. And he wasn't just saying it to make me feel bad. He was saying it because he genuinely believes it and he wants my best interest. That's how we want to leave people feeling. But that takes discernment, because that means you have to know how this person functions. Because once again, case-by-case scenario. There's certain things I could say to Zach that he'll receive one way, and if I said it to Ben, he might take it a different way. And so we have to use discernment, we have to get to know people, and we have to figure out, okay, how do I conduct it in such a way? Because, some people are going to like one dish over another. And we've got to figure that out. And once again, you can't control it, right? I mean, if you're speaking to a big group, there's going to be some people who just don't like it. Jesus was fine with that. Paul was fine with that. He's literally writing from prison right now, right? So he's not saying just be people pleasers. He's literally in prison as he's writing this, so obviously he's not concerned with that. He's just saying be mindful of it, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Right? So he's just saying use discernment. Right? So, one person will ask you a question, another person will ask you the same question. You might give two different answers. Right? Because one person might be ready for the full answer. One person might be ready for the full answer, but you know where they're coming at with their question, and you might have to answer something else and address something different. Right? So really, it's about using discernment and not just making everything black and white. Because you're trying to be mindful, and your main goal is pointing people to Christ, not simply exalting yourself and making yourself look like the most amazing person. Right? And that's why we ask people to pray for us, that we would know how to speak, and we could be articulate and clear, so that we would know how to answer each people, right? So you see how these actually tie into what he's asking them to pray for him, so that he can do the very things that he's asking them to do also, right? It all goes together. Tychicus will tell you about my activities, all about my activities. Who's Tychicus? Do y'all know?
Maybe a friend of Paul's.
Mm-hmm.
He delivered one of the letters, didn't he?
He did. Yeah, he delivered this letter, right? Which we can tell right here, right? He will tell you about my activities, which implies that he was with Paul and knows about what Paul's been doing, and he is now going to be with the Colossians, so he can tell them about what Paul's doing, right? So he went from one place to another. He's the one delivering this letter. He also seemingly delivered the letter to Ephesians, which makes sense because Paul wrote them at the same time, and Ephesus is on the way to Colossae. Ephesus is a coastal city, and Colossae is just like a few miles inland. So he probably, we can almost just like put it together in our heads. He probably went to Ephesus, spent some time there, delivered the letter, talked about it, filled them in on stuff, and then he went on to Colossae, where he had 2 letters to deliver. One of them was the letter of Colossians, and another one is the letter of Philemon, but Tychicus might not be the one who delivered that letter. The one who delivered that letter is probably a different guy who's going to be mentioned in just a second, and we'll talk about him. So Tychicus will tell you about all my activities. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. Wouldn't that be awesome to just like be Paul's buddy and like to have Paul call you that? I mean, that's just pretty cool. Given who Paul is, I mean, that's high praise, right? Beloved brother, faithful minister, fellow servant, right? So he is a beloved brother as in like he's like family to me, right? He's a brother in Christ. He's a fellow Christian. He's also a fellow minister, right? So we're co-workers. And he's a fellow servant, right? So just like me, we are both slaves to Christ, right? So he's just pouring himself out for Christ. And so he says he's coming by, he's going to give you the letter, and if you have any more questions about what I'm up to, just ask him. I wish we had what Tychicus had to say, but we don't have that information. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage your hearts. Okay, so that's why I sent him, right? He's like, hey, I'm sending him with this letter for you, so you know what I have to say, and if you want to know why he's hanging around for a bit, it's because I wanted him to actually tell you about what we're up to, so you can be encouraged even more. Because he mentioned at the beginning of the letter how he was encouraged by what they were doing, and so he's like, hey, let me exchange the favor, right? I want you to be encouraged that all because I'm in prison doesn't mean I've stopped preaching. I'm still going. And so he wants to encourage them. And with him, Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother who is one of you. Now this is shocking news. But in order to know how shocking it is, you have to know who Onesimus is. Does anybody here know who Onesimus is? Onesimus was a former slave. There's a book in the Bible called Philemon. It's around here, right? Ephesians, Colossians, it's there. Philemon was the host person for the church of Colossae. As best we can tell, it seems like Epaphras might have been the pastor or the lead teacher or something like that, or at least a servant there. He was one of the ministers. Whereas the church seemed to meet at Philemon's house, right? So he was probably a wealthy individual. The church of Colossae met there. And what had happened is that some amount of time before this, he had a slave named Onesimus who ran away. And whenever he ran away, Onesimus stole some of Philemon's stuff. At the time, Onesimus was not a Christian, right? And it's a really cool story. The book of Philemon is only 1 chapter long. So you can literally go study this very briefly. It's super short. Probably one of my favorite of Paul's letters, though, because it's just so entertaining and funny and convicting. And there's just so much story behind it. It's probably one of the books that there's so much story that you can just read into it. It's really cool. But Philemon had a slave named Onesimus. Onesimus ran away, and he stole stuff. So Philemon was probably pretty upset. Whenever Onesimus runs away, he ends up in Rome somehow. We don't know why. My theory is that if you're on the run, the best place to get lost is in Rome, right? I mean, it's the center, it's the Roman Empire. It's far away from Colossae, and it's filled with just a bunch of people. So he ends up in Rome, and somehow or other, he comes across Paul in prison. We don't know if he was just serving in the prison. We don't know if he sought Paul out because he'd heard about him. We don't know if he did something that landed him in prison, but somehow Onesimus encountered Paul. And Paul being Paul, he shared the gospel with Onesimus, and Onesimus got saved. And then somewhere along the road, Onesimus and Paul are talking, and Paul figures out who Onesimus is, and lo and behold, Paul knows Philemon. He's like, Philemon, I got Philemon saved. Like, I know him. You were his slave? And Onesimus is like, yeah. And then Paul's like, oh, well, here's the issue now. Now that you're an insider, as Christians, we submit to the authorities above us. And if you're a slave to Philemon, you actually need to go back. Because that's the right thing to do. I literally am just writing a letter to your home church saying that slaves should submit to masters, so it's kind of important. And you can kind of we don't know obviously how this interaction happened. I'm just kind of fleshing it out. But Onesimus eventually says, okay, I'll go back. Because if I'm a Christian, that's what I'm going to do. And so he sends him back. But he says, I'm going to help you out. And so he writes a letter to Philemon. And in that letter, basically, Paul's just guilt-tripping Philemon. And he says, hey, I'm sending you back Onesimus, and I hope that you'll receive him as a brother. Because he's a Christian now. And he's been of great service to me, and honestly, I wanted him to stay with me, but I knew that he was your slave, and I knew it was the right thing to do to send him back to you. So, here he is. I hope that you don't hold anything against him, and if you do hold anything against him, I pray that you'll hold it against me instead. And it's like, oh. And Paul's literally guilt-tripping him the whole time. And he's like, I want you to remember that you owe your life to me, because I'm the one who shared the gospel with you. And so, if you have anything, if you have any love for me, forgive Onesimus. But if you have to charge it against him, charge it against me instead, and I'll pay it back in full when I get out of prison, where I'm suffering on your behalf. And he says, and by the way, once I get out of prison, I'm coming for a visit. So prepare a room. And he says, confident that you'll do what I say and that you'll go even above and beyond. See you soon. So it seems like, to me, subtly, it seems like Paul's suggesting, hey, Philemon, I don't want you to just forgive Onesimus. I kind of want you to free him. He never explicitly says it, but it seems like that's his goal. And so the story of Philemon's amazing, and that's why what he says about Onesimus is here is so cool. Because here we have Philemon's being put in a really weird spot, because the Colossians would have been read publicly, right? They received the letter. They would have stood in front of the whole church. Everybody's gathered together. Somebody, it could have been Philemon himself. I have no idea. Somebody opens up the letter. It was probably Tychicus who read it. But opens up the letter and reads it publicly in front of everybody. And Paul says, I have sent with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. The last time they heard of Onesimus, he was on the run, and I can guarantee you Philemon has been dogging this guy since then. Oh, that stupid Onesimus. If I ever see him again, I'm going to show him, a punch in the face, give him an attitude adjustment. But now Paul says, Onesimus is here too. And now he's one of us. He's an insider. Treat him well. That's pretty good, and now everybody's looking over at Philemon and being like, ooh, how's he going to respond to this? And then Onesimus probably walks in the door and he's like, hey, by the way, Paul sent me with a letter for you too. And Philemon's like, oh, crap. So I love that. And with him Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you, they will tell you of everything that has taken place here. Which is probably a pretty good story, if you ask me. I mean, just the idea of Onesimus encountering Paul and then it'd be like, wait, you know my master? And there's just so much that you want to know, right? And he says, they'll tell you everything you have to ask. I was like, man, I want to know this story. But unfortunately, we don't have that. That leads us to the end of Colossians. I'll read the whole thing, and then we'll break it down. This will be a lot quicker to go through because it's mainly just farewells. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only men of the circumcision amongst my fellow workers of the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you, and for those in Laodicea and in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea, and to Nympha, and the church in her house. And when this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you also read the letter from Laodicea. And say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. Those 3 words right there, I want to write a book about those one day. Remember my chains. That's good stuff. We'll get there in a little bit. All right, let's walk through it. Aristarchus, a lot of this, like I said, we can go through this fairly quickly because it's literally just him being like, hey, so-and-so says hi, so-and-so says hi. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. There's another dude in prison with him, so Paul's not alone. Apparently some other Christian guy got wrapped into this as well, and he's also in prison, and he says hello. And so does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Okay, there's a story behind this too. Do y'all know the history of Paul and Mark and Barnabas? We've talked about it a little bit.
Isn't the story in Acts?
It is in Acts. So whenever Paul started his missionary journey, really, the reason Paul got accepted by the apostles is largely due to Barnabas. Because whenever Paul became saved, right, whenever he became a Christian, he came down to Jerusalem and he wanted to seek a meeting with the apostles just to basically confirm that, he was one of them. And they didn't want to meet with him at first, but then Barnabas convinced them that it was okay, right? And they said, he's a believer now. And so Barnabas, helped Paul become part of the group. Paul goes up and he lives back in Tarsus for a while, probably like a decade, I think. So back in his hometown. And Barnabas goes off and he kind of serves as one of the bishops or one of the pastors in a church called Antioch, right? Well, a church in Antioch, which basically there were two main churches at that time. There was the church in Jerusalem and there was the church in Antioch, which is just a little bit north in Syria region. And this is the church where they first became known as Christians. Prior to that, they were called Followers of the Way. And Barnabas was the church there, and as the church is growing, he realizes they need help. And he's like, I've got the perfect guy in mind. So Barnabas goes up to Tarsus, he gets Paul, he says, hey, will you come help me down in Antioch? And so Paul does that. And as they're there, Paul, I guess, just lays out his vision for what he thinks Christ is calling him to do. And Paul and Barnabas become the first major missionary duo. And they start traveling everywhere, and they go on this big missionary journey, and they bring with them Barnabas' younger cousin, Mark, or John Mark. This is the guy who wrote the Gospel of Mark. So they travel around, but somewhere along this journey, Mark gets cold feet, and he abandons them. We don't know if he got homesick. We don't know the full details. We just know that Mark left. And Paul was not happy about this. So whenever it comes time to go on their second missionary journey, Paul's like, hey, Barnabas, let's get going. And Barnabas says, all right, let me go get Mark. And Paul says, no, we're not bringing Mark. And we don't know the full conflict that happened between them. The book of Acts just tells us that the discussion got so heated that eventually they had to part ways. And I can kind of picture how it probably went. Just because we know a lot about Paul, and we know enough about Barnabas to know that he's a very encouraging person who likes to stick up for people. And I think they both probably had good points. I view that Paul probably said, hey, Mark abandoned us last time, and we've got to make good use of our time. We need to be discerning, and we need to recognize that there is more at stake than just us. And so I recognize you want Mark to be with us, but he abandoned us last time, and if he does that again, he could die, we could die, it could put the gospel at stake. It'll be a terrible testimony for other people if they see somebody getting cold feet and abandoning us in the middle of this. We can't bring him with us. On the other hand, Barnabas is probably saying, he's my cousin. Aren't we supposed to be gracious? Aren't we supposed to be forgiving? 70 times 7. And so I think that they probably both have really good points, which to me is encouraging because you have two godly people who probably have very good points who recognize that, you know what, we're going to have to go separate ways because they kind of think God's calling them to different things. But it seems like it did not end well between them, right? Strong disagreement to where literally over John Mark, Paul and Barnabas, the original dynamic duo, part paths. And Paul ends up traveling with a guy named Silas. Along the way, they pick up a kid named Timothy, and they travel around, and they're the new dynamic duo, and all these amazing stories come from it. We get books of the Bible, and it's amazing. So this is really cool. Because here we have Paul in prison, and who does he say is with him? Mark. Well, that's encouraging, right? So apparently they mended things, and Mark's with them. And he says, Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions, if he comes to you, welcome him. So apparently the Colossians had received instructions regarding Mark before, and Paul says, hey, if he comes to you, welcome him in, right? He's our brother. I just think that's really cool. And so that's why you need to know like the whole story, because if you know the whole story, you're like, that's a really cool detail. Typically you would just breeze right through it. But if you know the story, you're like, whoa, that's cool. Mark is visiting him there. Which, when it comes to my thesis that I wrote for seminary, my whole thing was about the composition of the Gospels and debating about what order they are written in. And typically people suggest that Mark was written first, mainly because it's the shortest. I don't agree with that. I actually propose that Matthew was written first, and then Luke, and then Mark. And most people would say, well, Mark is the shortest, so why would it come last? I'm not convinced that Mark was primarily written to be its own unique thing. It seems like, to me, it's almost like ratifying Matthew and Luke together with one another. And I think we have reason for this. And this is one of those internal evidences that I had to cite, because we know that the book of Acts ended whenever Paul arrives in prison in Rome. So right before he wrote these letters. The book of Acts is a sequel to the Gospel of Luke, which would seem to suggest that Luke was written prior to that. And we know that Luke conducted interviews in order to compose his gospel. And we know that Paul was in prison in Caesarea for a few years, which would have been plenty of time for Luke to travel around and do that, because the book of Acts tells us that Luke was with Paul during that time. And so you can see Luke traveling around, visiting there, and then they go off to Rome, and during that time period, Luke is writing the book of Acts. They arrive in Rome, the book's over, and now, if Matthew was written first, and Luke is also written, and then Mark happens to be in Rome at the same time as them, because we're going to see Luke is also here, right? So we have Paul, Luke, and Mark in here at the same time. Seems like a perfect time for Mark to be written, right? Because if they have the Gospel of Matthew, which was written a lot earlier, possibly, and then you have Luke, it's like, oh, okay, well, let's go back and forth, and like you're comparing both of them and contrasting them, and to me, like that was just part of my argument, so I thought that's really cool. And little details like that, they tell us things. And so Mark is there, and also Jesus, who is called Justus. In case you didn't know, Jesus was a very common name at the time. So he's clarifying this is not Jesus Christ, this is another Jesus. And he's also with them. These are the only men of the circumcision amongst my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they've been a comfort to me. What's he talking about there? What does he mean when he says these are the only men of the circumcision?
Are they other Jewish people?
Yeah. They're the only Jewish people who are with me. Which to him is kind of cool. Because here they are proclaiming the Jewish king, yet he's only got, 3 Jewish guys with him? He's like, yeah, there's just me and 3 other dudes. We're the only Jews. Everybody else is Gentile. But he says that having them with him is really cool. And I kind of like that. So he's still creating that distinction between circumcision and uncircumcision, but it's not a matter of disunity. It's just a matter of hey, we've got both together, right? It's actually, he's creating the distinction to highlight the unity, right? He's like, yes, we've got Jews, but I've only got a few of them. And we got so many Gentiles here too. And they've been comforting him. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you. This is the one who earlier on in the book, he said that Epaphras has informed him of everything that had been going on in Colossae. And like I mentioned, Paul had never been to Colossae before, but Epaphras was from Colossae, and it seems like him and Paul knew each other. So it seems like most likely he met Paul in Ephesus, which, like I mentioned, is pretty close to Colossae. And Paul actually spent 3 years in Ephesus kind of as a pastor. And so it would have made sense if Epaphras met him there, and then maybe Epaphras went to Colossae and maybe even planted the church. We don't fully know all the details. But Epaphras knows the people in Colossae. That's why he visited Paul, and he's informing him about stuff. And he says, hey, Epaphras is with me here too. He's one of y'all, and he greets you too. He wants to let you know that he's doing fine. It's also possible that Epaphras is the same as Epaphroditus that we hear mentioned in Philippians. Because he says Epaphroditus is here and that he'd gotten sick. And he says, hey, he's fine. And so we don't know if they're the same person or not, but it is possible. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. So what is Epaphras doing while he's there?
I'd like to think that he's praying intensely that they stay mature in Christ.
Yeah, so he's praying, and what specifically is he praying for? You kind of just said it.
God's will be done.
God's will be done. But you said a second ago, standing mature in Christ. What does he mean by that? So what specifically is Epaphras praying for the Colossians? It's the thing in pink.
Is it fully... Go ahead, Brandon. I was just going to say fully assured.
Okay.
Assurance.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say, standing strong in the faith.
Yeah. It's that they would be growing. Notice he's not just praying for their salvation. They're already saved. Right? Once again, I just mainly highlight that because I'm trying to highlight things where we kind of lost focus as the American church. Because usually our main focus, if we're praying for other people, usually it's about that they'd get saved. That is not, most of the prayers we've talked about in this book are not about people just getting saved. That's obviously something they're praying about. But they're talking about praying for fellow Christians that they would grow in their faith. How often do we pray for that for one another? Right? how often do I just say, God, I pray that you will help Zach. I pray that you'll help Olivia. I pray that you'll help George grow in their love for you. That's what Epaphras is doing. Paul sees him over there kneeling in the corner praying, and Epaphras is saying, God, I pray for Onesimus. I pray for Philemon. I pray that all of them, that not only do they know you, but I pray that they'll come to know you more. And I pray that they'll be more assured in their faith, and that they'll have more confidence, and that they'll be more bold to live for you more, even if it creates opposition. That's just a pretty cool prayer. So that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea and Hierapolis. So he's just saying, I can testify to you that this guy is a hard worker. And he didn't come to Rome for a vacation. He has been coming to Rome to do work. And he did a lot of stuff, not only for the Colossians, but for those in Laodicea and Hierapolis. He cares deeply for these people, and he's working for them. Which is interesting because he's not with them. So whenever Paul talks about work, it seems like he's primarily talking about the prayer, which Paul views as work. We usually just view prayer as an afterthought, but this guy's probably sweating, and he's getting into it, right? Because it's a big deal. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you. I actually have a book. I haven't read it yet, but it's called Luke, the beloved physician, and it's just I think telling the story from Luke's perspective. But Luke, the beloved physician, this is the verse that lets us know that Luke was a physician. Right? You might hear that Luke was a doctor. This is the verse that tells us that. I don't think there's anywhere else in the Bible that explicitly tells us that, but there it is. Luke, this is the guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke. Thank you. If I was with my students, they'd be like, John? They would know the correct answer. They just would be sarcastic because they like that. But yeah, this is the guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke. This is just really cool. I mean, you have the Apostle Paul, Mark, and Luke all just hanging out with one another at the same time. I mean, I would love to sit in that room. That'd just be cool. You got right here, Luke. Okay, Paul wrote the most books of the New Testament. Luke wrote the most content overall of the New Testament. Because whenever you take the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Acts, that actually accounts for more words total than all of Paul's letters. And so, literally, these guys, Luke and Paul alone, wrote 90% of the New Testament. And they're just hanging out with one another. That's just really cool to me. Then you've got, Matthew wrote some, and then there's Mark, and then you have Peter, and then John, and James, and Jude. That's it. But, these guys wrote so much, and that's just so cool. They're just, hanging out. We would not be here if it weren't for these guys hanging out. This is just cool to me. It's friend goals, It's dang. Imagine that, right? Imagine that there was somebody 3,000 years from now or something like that who was talking about this group, and there were just members in this group who were so faithful to God that we did something that had an impact for thousands of years to come. And I'm not saying that should be our goal, right? But there have been things like that, right? I mean, the Protestant Reformation. That started with just a group of people recognizing that there were some problems that needed to be addressed, and they did it. And we're sitting here because of them, right? I mean, I think of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Those dudes were best buddies. And they would literally just meet up each week to talk about their stories. And they would criticize one another. And they produced The Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia and all these other amazing things. That is cool. Just the impact that, people who actually love one another can have on the kingdom of God. That's what I kind of hope for this group. Not necessarily that we would have that impact, but that we would have that friendship that could produce an impact like that. Even if the impact is very small scale, even if it only impacts the people here, that's fine. I just think that's really, really cool. Whenever you think about that, right? Just Luke, Mark, and Paul all hanging out. Did they recognize how significant they were at the time? Probably not. If anything, they probably thought they weren't significant at all, and that was the key. Because they weren't striving for significance. They were just striving to be faithful. I love that. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. So he's just saying, he's saying all the people who greet them, and then he says also let other people know that I'm greeting them as well. And when this letter has been read among you, so we just kind of see that this is how the practice would have been, right? They would get there and they would read it. Most likely, Tychicus would be the one reading it, because it seems like there might have been even a performative nature to this, where Tychicus would have stood up and he might have even practiced the reading of it so that he would be able to emphasize things and not necessarily make it dramatized, but that's probably how it would have been done. When this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you also read the letter from Laodicea. So we have this idea that Paul expects, like he's kind of attributing a certain level of authority to this letter, right? Like this isn't just for y'all, it's for other Christians as well, which is really useful for us, right? Because whenever we're trying to figure out, does it apply to us or not? Well, Paul does seem to think there is there are general principles that go beyond just the church of Colossae. So yeah, have the Laodiceans read it too, because they could learn from this as well. So for us, we're like, oh, sweet. That's Paul basically saying, yeah, if you're a Christian, you have a lot you can learn from this. And he's not saying that proudly. He's saying this as an apostle, right? He's got that authority. And say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord. There's a story behind that, and I wish I knew the story. You know? I don't know much about Archippus, and I don't know what ministry that he received in the Lord, but apparently Paul's saying, tell him to go do it. Does that mean that he's not been doing it? I don't know. Maybe it means that it was a challenging thing, that he might have hesitation, and maybe he needed encouragement. I don't know, but there's a story there, and I wish I did know it. Too bad. One day, hopefully in heaven, I'll just be like saying, hey, anybody know Archippus? Hey, what was that ministry you received in the Lord? Could you tell me? I've been wondering, but I don't know. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. This was his typical way of doing things. Sometimes Paul wouldn't actually be the one writing his letters. Sometimes he would be the one, like he'd speak it and somebody else would write it. That person was called an amanuensis, if you just wanted a fun vocabulary word. I don't know how to spell it, so don't ask. But he'd have an amanuensis, and he would speak it forth to them. And then he would typically sign the letter by his own hand, and that was his way of, it's his signature, right? It's him letting people know, like, this is actually me. In the book of 2 Thessalonians, which we just went through on Sunday night with the discipleship group, we talked about this because Paul was kind of getting on to them, because he wrote them 1 Thessalonians, and they received it. And then when he writes 2 Thessalonians, he's like, hey guys, so I've heard that y'all have been like receiving letters that like claim to be from me, but they weren't from me. And so I just wanted to clarify. Anytime you receive a letter from me, I always put my signature at the bottom. And so he said, like, he literally at the very end of 2 Thessalonians, he's like, I write this in my own hand, as is my custom, in all my letters, farewell. So he's just specifying, like, if you want to know it's from me, look at the signature. And so the idea of giving your signature has been a thing that dates back 2,000 years at least. And so Paul did that. And he seemed to have a very distinct handwriting style. Because in other letters he says, see with what large letters I'm writing to you. Some people, that has led them to speculate that maybe Paul had poor eyesight. And that he literally just like had to write with big letters. I think that might be reading too much into it. I don't know. Some people say that though. I think that maybe he just had larger handwriting and that it was distinct. And you're like, hey, like, look at these letters. It's definitely me. The other dude had better handwriting and it was like more concise. He's like, this is me, right? So he says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. And then we get to my 3 favorite words in the entire book of Colossians. We're going to spend some time on those, but I'm going to skip those for a second. He ends by saying, grace be with you, right? Farewell, right? Just grace be with you. Typical greeting. But let's go back to these words. Remember my chains. A few months ago, I actually went and just wrote an entire song about those words because I just loved them. Why does he say this?
I think he wants us to remember what he's suffered for the cause of Christ.
That's exactly what he's saying, but why? Why would you ever do that? I mean, it's a super poetic thing to say. Like, what a way to end the letter. But why would he say this? Remember my chains.
I think he wants the Colossian church to remember that something about like imprisonment, like other people are going through other things, not just him.
Yeah.
Something sort of like that.
Yeah, just like, Brian, could you grab my old phone right over there? Yes?
I think when he says, remember my chains, in Colossians 1, the first chapter, he mentions that he's in prison because of Jesus and of the good news.
Yeah.
He didn't have to be in prison, but he's there because of it.
Yeah.
He's suffering because of it.
Yeah, it's because his chains represent something more.
To be in prison is for Jesus.
Yes. I love it.
And when you see that, that's the reason why he says it.
Yeah.
Like encouragement.
Absolutely. I think it's encouragement, conviction, hope, joy. Like, there's so much in those three little words. That's why I love them. Because the chains really mean very little to Paul. Right? Like, I mean, they're just chains. He doesn't really care about them. But it's what those chains represent. Right? Like, the chains tell a story. Because most people, like I mentioned, like most people, they go about seeking self-service. Right? I mean, like even us, right? We are Christians who know we should be living for God, but we spend most of our lives living like the old self. Right? And we just pursue our own selfish thing. We pursue our own advancement. Even whenever it comes to serving God, we seek advancement. I mean, this is something I was talking to Brianna about earlier. I've got this whole YouTube channel thing going, and it's very difficult for me because basically the way that you're a successful YouTuber necessitates you having a bunch of subscribers. And it necessitates you growing. And I feel conflicted because like the temptation is so there to just do it for my own glory, right? And be like, oh, I just want to be known. And it's like, no, like that's not the goal. The goal is to serve God even if there's only 500 subscribers. But instead, that temptation is there. And even though I'm wanting to serve God, I want to serve myself more, right? And that's how we're just wired. We're just sinful human beings. And sometimes, like I see fellow people that I'm subscribed to, and they have more subscribers than I do, or other people that I partner with and stuff, and they have more subscribers than I do. And rather than being proud and joyful that the word of God's being spread, I feel bitter and envious. And I'm like, people listen to them more than me. And that's so terrible. It's so corrupt. It's like, how horrible are we that even in our ministry to God, we're trying to serve ourselves? That's how most of us are. But that's not what Paul's doing, is it? He's in chains, right? He's not worried about getting subscribers. He's literally sacrificed everything for Christ, right? He doesn't have to be in chains. That's the beautiful part. They were literally about to free him, and he said, I appeal to Caesar, and that made him be in prison longer. Because he says, you know what? I see an opportunity to go to Rome and preach to Caesar and to preach to his guards. And if I'm free, I wouldn't have that opportunity. He talks about that in Philippians. He says that, like, I'm in prison and I get to preach to people I would have never gotten to preach to if I was free. Because I'm literally chained up to Caesar's bodyguards. So you know they're hearing the gospel. And he even says that members of Caesar's household are members of the faith now. And so Paul, he's not seeking his own advancement. It's literally about God. And so when he says, remember my chains, it's saying, remember what Christ is worth, right? He's worth everything, even your freedom, right? That's crazy. So the reason I had Brianna grab my old phone is because months ago, I led my students through Colossians, and that's when these words started jumping out to me, because I hadn't spent a lot of time in Colossians, but then, man, I got to those words, and I was like, oh, remember my chains. And I just spent time reflecting on it. And I wrote down different things that Paul could be intending here. And I wrote down 7 things because 7, it's a number. It's an important number. And these are the things I wrote. So first off, he says, remember my chains, because the gospel isn't just about making your life easier, right? So it's conviction, right? Because here we are, going to church, and we sit down on Sundays thinking, okay, I hope that the pastor gives me a really motivating sermon that just leaves me happy and I can have an easier life and just filled with more joy and awesomeness. And yes, God does want you to feel joy and peace, but that isn't the primary goal. The primary goal is that God receive the glory and that you learn how much Christ is worth. And so the gospel is not just about making your life easier, and Paul testifies to that. Remember my chains. Don't forget where he's at when he's writing this letter. It's a pretty good message. Second thing, sometimes people will misinterpret your actions. Paul is a prisoner. Typically, if you look at a prisoner, you think of a criminal. And you think of somebody who does not have the best reputation. Paul is writing to them from prison, says, remember my chains. So that's comforting. right? Because it's like, hey, all because you serve Christ doesn't mean that everybody's going to like you. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to support you. It doesn't mean that people are going to think that you're a righteous person. People condemned Jesus as a blasphemer and a criminal. Paul is in prison as a criminal. Most of the apostles were killed because they were viewed as criminals. And so whenever we go about our Christian lives thinking that being faithful to Christ will immediately make people like us and think that we are righteous and better, that means we're not reading the gospel close enough. Because if anything, people might think that we're worse. Because Jesus, they called him a drunkard. He wasn't a drunkard, but that's how they viewed him. Right? You know what they called the early church? There were 3 things that they charged the early church with. They called them incestuous, they called them atheists, and they called them cannibals. Do you know why? They called them incestuous because they were always calling one another brothers and sisters, which nowadays in our cultures is everything, but that's just how Christianity has affected things. But they'd be like, hey, this is my wife, Sister Cindy. And they're like, Sweet Home Alabama started playing in the background, and they're like, oh no. Yeah, this is my husband, Brother Carl. It's like, oh no. So they called them incestuous. They also called them atheists, which is ironic because they believe in God, but it was because in the Roman Empire, we believe in many gods. And they were rejecting 1,000,000 gods for the sake of one, which if you look at it, it looks a lot like atheism because you're rejecting the majority of the gods just to worship one. Whereas really they're saying, but no, our God is the one true God. But they didn't understand that, so they called them atheists. And then they also called them cannibals. Do you know why? Communion, right? They said, yes, we gather together all the time to drink the blood of Christ and eat his flesh. Yikes. But so from an outsider's perspective, they don't understand. And we look weird, and it's confusing, and it's strange. And Paul says, that's fine. Remember my chains, right? It's not about having the best reputation either. Third thing, God and his gospel are real, and both are worth suffering for. Right? That message is pretty straightforward, right? He's in chains because he has deemed it worthy, and he's asking them to remember so that when the time comes, and they are also threatened with chains, they'll remember his and say, you know what? Chain me up. Fourthly, not everyone shares our freedom, nor are we entitled to it. This is the thing that steps on the toes of Americans, right? I'm an American, but I have to say what the Bible says, not what the Constitution says. We do not have the natural right to freedom. Is that God's ideal world? Absolutely. Because we're made in the image of God. We shouldn't have freedom taken away. But we live in a sinful world, and we should consider ourselves entitled to freedom. In America, we have this amazing thing where we live in a free country, but if that day ever came where that freedom was taken away, a lot of Christians would get really upset. All you have to do is go watch the God is Not Dead movies to see that. Because those movies are all about whining whenever your religious freedom is taken away. Paul's not whining. He was in prison unjustly for being a Christian, but he's not complaining because he doesn't have a victim mentality. He's not entitled to freedom. Yes, freedom's nice, but you're not entitled to it. And so if that day ever comes, whenever our freedom is taken away, I hope nobody in this room complains about it. We're going to be tempted to. I'm going to be tempted to, right? Because it's so easy to get in that mindset. And sometimes we place the Constitution over the Bible, and we think, no, you're taking away my rights. It's like, well, no. We're all slaves to Christ. And so if being a slave to Christ results in our freedom being taken away, so be it. So Paul says, remember my chains, so that you don't start complaining whenever you're put in chains as well. Fifthly, we need to be in prayer for those suffering for Christ. Right? Yeah. Call to action. Remember my chains, so that they start praying for him. Right? Because he's not going through the best time right now. He is in prison. And so remembering his chains is a reminder, hey, we need to pray for Paul. Because he's still in prison. He's still suffering. Yes, he's encouraging us through his letters, but we need to pray for him. Same thing for us. Yes, we have freedom over here in America. There's a lot of people who don't have that freedom, even right now. So we should keep those people in mind, and we should be praying for them as well. Because there are people who are in chains for Christ. Remember those chains to sober us up and to pray on their behalf. Sixthly, we need to be willing to share in their fate. So this goes back to the whole sober-mindedness thing. Right? You remember his chains so that we can prepare ourselves mentally for the day whenever we're challenged with that same thing. Hopefully none of us will ever have that freedom taken away. But we don't know. We have no idea. And so we need to remember Paul's chains so that we can say, how would I react if I were put in that same scenario? Or to go more extreme, if somebody walked in the door right now and put a gun to our heads and said, renounce the name of Christ or I'm going to kill you, what would you do? That's happened to people in the past. Remember it so that you can mentally prepare it. Because the last thing you want to do is have somebody walk in the door and do that to you and you've never even thought about it. Because then you're probably going to buckle under the pressure. Right? So remember Paul's chains and think about, how would I respond? Would I respond like Paul or would I respond like Judas? Figure it out. Seventhly, their suffering should remind us to take Christ seriously. He's just saying, guys, I wouldn't be in chains unless I thought that Jesus was the most important thing in the world. That's been the whole book of Colossians, right? He is preeminent. He's above all. Remember my chains so that you can remember why I'm in chains. Right? I'm here because there's a Savior who died for us, and he was the God in heaven who set aside his throne to wear our chains and to be nailed to a cross that we deserved. And now I count it joy to suffer on his behalf because he suffered on my behalf. And so he says, take Jesus seriously. Don't make Jesus just a compartmentalized thing where it's like, okay, I go to church on Sundays and Wednesdays and treating God like you're like visiting hours in a prison. He should be all-consuming. He is the preeminent one above all things. And he says, remember my chains because I was willing to set aside everything for the God who set aside everything for me to be with him. So remember my chains. I love those words because they're 3 words, but man, there is so much in them. And I think that's probably a good way to end Colossians, right? Because that's the whole story of the book, right? It's about Jesus being above all. And Paul didn't even have to write the whole letter. Honestly, he could have read, all he needed to write was remember my chains, and that could have been enough, right? Because that letter right there, like those 3 words right there, communicate the entire book, right? You want to talk about the authority we talked about last week? Remember my chains. He's submitting, right? He's not trying to break out of prison. He's submitting because there is a greater Lord unto whom he's submitting, and because he's submitting to him, he's going to submit to the ones that God put in charge, even though that lands him in prison, right? Putting off the old self, putting on the new self. Remember my chains, right? His old self was all about seeking self-service, right? He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He was excelling through the ranks of Judaism, and he was seeking prominence. But he put off the old self, and he put on the new self. And rather than rising through the ranks, he set aside everything, and now he's in prison. So literally the whole message of Colossians is in those 3 words. I absolutely think it's amazing. Do y'all have anything y'all want to add? There's a lot that still could be said. I just wanted to get that out because it's 9 o'clock, and I wanted to wrap us up. But anything y'all want to add?
When I think of those 3 words, remember my chains, I always think about your song. You know, the Finish Well.
Oh, I forgot. I wrote that one as well. Yeah. But I have a song literally called Remember My Chains. Let me see if I can find the lyrics.
Finish Well?
That's a different song. Oh, no. Oh, jeez. Remember My Chains. I know it's written from Paul's perspective, right? I know you've heard the message, too crazy to be real, that the God who made the universe came down just to be killed. It's a story far too beautiful. How could it all be true? That the unseen God made himself seen to die for me and you. He's the firstborn of creation, the creator of all things, yet he made it his commitment to dwell with you and me. And if you think it's just a fairy tale to improve your sorry mood, then sit right back and listen up and let me ask one thing of you. Remember my chains. Remember my words. Remember the shackles upon my wrists as I wrote what you heard. Remember my scars. Remember my pain. Remember the message in which you believed about the Lamb who was slain. Oh, remember my chains. This story is not a fairy tale to help the weak survive, but God stepped into history, and I tell you he's alive. And if you don't believe me, just look upon my scars. They testify that I believe in what I've said this far. For Christ is not just worth living for, he's worth dying for as well. It's the least we could give the one who saved us all from hell. But if you need encouragement to love boldly by your faith, then raise your chin and lend your ears and hear the words I say. And then it repeats the chorus. In everything preeminent, that's what he must be. He deserves our all and nothing less. To him be the glory. So in your daily actions, I bid you walk worthy, and if you doubt this gospel truth, please remember me. Remember my chains. I love those words. Think about those. Right? Next week, we are going to be going into 2 Samuel. Huge shift. We're actually going back 2,000 years, basically 1,000 years. 3,000 years from us, 1,000 years from Paul. We're going to go back into the life of David, and we're going to go into narrative stuff, and we're going to be going a lot less in depth than we did go here, because we're going to be covering broad swaths of it. We're going to give you the big picture, but it'll still be very good and advantageous, and hopefully the big picture stuff will inspire you to go more in depth throughout the week. It'll be good. Y'all, anything y'all want to add? Dopey dope. Can somebody pray for us to finish up? I'll do it. Lord, we praise you and we thank you for everything that you are. And I pray that as we go throughout the rest of our evening and as we go throughout the rest of our week, we will remember not only Paul's chains, but every single Christian who was willing to bear chains for you and was willing to set aside their old self to live for you, God. As we leave here, I pray that we won't leave here unchanged, but that we will leave here as people who want to live for you more, and not only people who want to live for you more, but who are better equipped to actually do it. Increase our faith, increase our love, increase our understanding of all that you are and how worthy you are to be served, God, and help us be more grateful. Help us be grateful for everything that you are, everything that you've done, everything that you're going to do, and help us set our eyes on the hope that is to come, God. And let us never look left or right, but always set our eyes on you, daily denying ourselves and laying our lives down as living sacrifices, because that is acceptable worship unto you, God. Help us die to ourselves each day and live for you, casting off the old self and putting on the new, and help us not only do this individually, but let us encourage one another as a body of believers and as close-knit friends who love one another. Let us learn to live for you and help push each other to run the race set before us, to fulfill the ministry that you've called us to, each and every one of us, God. And let the words that we've studied over the past few weeks not be studied in vain, but plant them as seeds within our hearts to grow into beautiful trees that bear fruit for you, both in our individual lives, but also in the world around us, that your kingdom would be expanded and that those citizens in your kingdom will grow. We praise you, God. Help us learn to praise you more. We love you. Help us learn to love you more. We desire you. Help us learn to desire you more. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for everything that you have done, that you are doing, and that you will do. In your name we pray. Amen.